In 1897, an extra edition of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer hyped the arrival of a steamer from Alaska, loaded with more than a ton of solid gold. Gold, gold, gold. 68 rich men on the steamer Portland. Stacks of yellow metal. The article celebrated the steamer's cargo, worth $700,000. Thousands rushed to see the boat dock. Soon, Seattle was mad with Klondike fever. Fortune seekers quit their jobs and began the journey north. Newspapers around the country printed stories, spurring a stampede to Alaska by way to Seattle. Print continued its influence during the Alaska pipeline rush in the 1970s. A New York Daily News article about the boom resulted in 6,056 and 1,370 phone calls to the pipeline company in 1 month. But starting in 2011, it was the scream that propelled people all over America to the North Dakota oil field. One viewer in Olympia, Washington, saw a news feature on the oil boom during a blur of Jersey Shore episodes. He was struggling to find work after being laid off as a graphic artist at a sign shop and had been melting for weeks into a tattered couch in front of the TV, spending his unemployment checks on booze, pizza, and ice cream. The marijuana was running out. He scraped the resin out of his pipe in desperation. Greg Thompson taped the episode and watched it several more times, feeling his excitement build. He packed his belongings and rode the Amtrak 1,100 miles east. When the train finally stopped in Williston, he stepped eagerly into the dark of winter and walked down Main Street, past the day labor office, the strip clubs, the biker bar, crossed the wall with the Ten Commandments, the Chamber of Commerce, and J.C. Penney, and into the lights of the main thoroughfare, 2nd Avenue West. Greg called hotel after hotel to book a room, but they were all full. Weary of the foreboding night ahead, Greg went into the lounge of the Vegas Motel and ordered a Jack and Coke. He played pool and met a man who gave him a lead for a job doing wireline, which involved handling explosives on frack jobs. It must have been midnight when he rolled his suitcase down the road again. Greg spotted a mattress store and walked around the back. Greg climbed into a dumpster filled with discarded mattresses and built himself a fort that would guard against the icy winds. He created a bed out of an old recliner and burrowed himself in bubble wrap. Greg smoked a bowl and began filming himself, blue eyes peering from a pale face, shining from the darkness, tilted as though he were being filmed at gunpoint in a hostage video.
Color me crazy. I did what I had to do. Got a $19 an hour job offer. Pending my clearances because we work with explosives.
Early in the morning, the shriek of a garbage truck awoke him. He sent video of the dumpster fortress he had built to his brother, who loved it, and told him he should post it on YouTube. Thus were the beginnings of a small-time internet star. 6,466 hits. Hey, just a note, I will be down in Philadelphia for Podcast Movement 2018. That's a big convention, Podcast Movement, and it's the first time that My History Can Beat Up Your Politics has been at a podcasting convention. I've been podcasting for 12 years, really, as of this time. This was about the time in 2006 when we did our first episode Presidents and the Media about George W. Bush. The use of the New York Times to kind of put stories in and how other presidents had used the media in different ways. It's something that's available in the archive, and that gives me a good opportunity to plug the premium podcast for My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. And at different levels, you will get archived episodes. You'll get them at all levels. It's just how many you get. And we do have people who are members of the Grover Cleveland Club, which is $8 a month, and then you get access to the whole archive. As I do get some questions from time to time, like, what happened to the archive? And it's still available. It's just been folded into the My History Can Beat Up Your Politics premium extra podcast. You also get the extra podcast. And there's an archive building for that extra podcast because I've been doing it since 2016. So if you want to hear stories like about the 1808 election and the Romanism and rebellion comment that probably changed that election and threw it to Grover Cleveland, we discuss that and what really happened there. You know, if it is really true, how come James Blaine didn't cover quickly enough? We talk about those things. I talk more about John F. Kennedy's run for vice president. 10 things that you didn't know about the 1972 election and the McGovern campaign, and particularly about the Thomas Eagleton affair, where for 18 days, McGovern had a running mate that he was forced to let go. There's more. We have a recent episode about presidents and Canadian prime ministers, including one with the last name of Trudeau. But not the Trudeau you're thinking of.
Mr. President, Prime Minister Trudeau. Mr. President, hello. How are you? Very well. I just got back from vacation earlier this week, and I wanted to phone you to tell you how distressed I was about all this noise that is going on around the Watergate thing. I want to tell you that, as far as I'm concerned, the people here with...
The last episode we had, The Dark Side of Booms, was a replay of a 2014 episode. I will do replays. I know some people, are like, oh, I already heard this and things like that. Yes, if you're a very long-time listener to the show, you will have heard things. I'm trying to only replay where it's been a while, or where it's just such an important topic in the news that we have to talk about it. Now, 4 years, I think, is pretty fair. So you'll hear me start to replay a few of those good 2014 episodes here and there. There's a particular reason why I replayed The Dark Side of the Boom. By the way, thanks for all the positive comments that I've gotten about it. I think there's a few folks who hadn't heard it or didn't realize that it was something that was recorded a while ago. We got an opportunity to speak to journalist Maya Rao, who stayed up in the North Dakota oil fields for a time and interviewed all sorts of oil workers, truckers, cashiers, and everybody involved in what was a really giant boom at the time. Artifacts of dreams abandoned have long strewn North Dakota's landscape. Old farmsteads, shuttered schools, wood planks rotting in the prairie grass. The Northern Pacific Railway drove settlements along the tracks west of the Missouri River. But residents built too many towns, too many churches, too many farms, newspapers, and schools to support a society that never grew as populous as planned. Farmers struggled against blizzards and droughts and meager harvests. Some starved. Many fled. Half of North Dakota's communities were losing people by the 1930s, when the state's population peaked at nearly 681,000. Citizens clustered the cities of Bismarck, Grand Forks, and Fargo. The western edge of the state faded into earthen bones as the young left for better prospects and the old died off. And what would end up changing that, according to Maya Rao, is not so much an incredible discovery, but a discovery of sorts. See, it was always known that there's oil up in North Dakota. That's not new. North Dakota's first oil discovery came in 1951 in the little town of Tioga. But the petroleum was difficult to extract. A burst of oil development came in the 1980s, followed by a oil bust that stranded local governments with debt. So it's in 2008 when advances in hydraulic fracturing, we know that is fracking, and horizontal drilling confirmed the largest domestic oil deposit since the discovery of the reserves under Prudhoe Bay, Alaska 4 decades earlier. Billions of barrels of oil lay in the Bakken Shale Formation. Western North Dakota became an astonishing laboratory for the Darwinian, breakneck capitalism that one imagined was no longer possible in modern America. Something Maya in another chapter refers to as the rhapsody of the free market. Outsiders engulfed the state to get rich, to hide out, or to start over. The state's population grew for the first time in the lives of even its most elderly residents. Observers compared it to the California gold rush, when hordes of people flocked into an untrammeled terrain to make their fortune. But the journey to the West Coast then, we've talked about this on the cast at different times, by horse or ox mule wagon across the country was dangerous. Gold seekers fought cholera, hostile Indians, starvation. Voyages by sea were not that much better. We talked about how visitors to the early California would have to go, usually through Costa Rica, Nicaragua, or Panama, take a steamship from New York, and then get across the jungle one way or the other. Often that was the perilous part. Not that the sea voyages were that easy either. And then get to California that way. One of the state's early senators, when it becomes a state, Broderick, is riding across on a stage wagon and injures his back. It's thrown up by the horse, injures the back. This wasn't an easy travel. But Maya Rao makes the point that in 2008 in North Dakota, you have a little different dynamic in a boom there. Adventurers drove, hitchhiked, or rode the train or bus to North Dakota. There was little of the speculative nature of past booms. Nobody wildcatted anymore. Companies knew where the oil was and had the technology to extract it. Newcomers were almost guaranteed to find a job, as long as they could pass a drug test. And if they couldn't, those were easy enough to fake. Journalists came from around the world to North Dakota, often for just a few days. Maya Rao was one of them, traveling from Minneapolis to the oil field for a week in 2012. As she said, observers always said this would be studied in history classes a century from now, and history demands a book. So Maya Rao visited North Dakota again in 2014, and this time stayed for a much longer time. Maya Rao is a staff writer in the Washington, D.C. bureau of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and her work has appeared in The Atlantic, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and other sources. She is the author of The Great American Outpost, Dreamers, Mavericks, and the Making of an Oil Frontier. And she's joining me on My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. Maya, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
North Dakota was our kind of bucking the trend state there during the Great Recession. While everybody else was down, it was up. You looked at what happened there, and you talked about the human side of that boom, and your book has a lot of stories. I mean, a few years before, North Dakota had been trying to bring people to the state, and then is getting an onslaught of truck drivers and other oil field workers.
It really drew a variety of people from not just around the nation, but from around the world. And so you had a lot of laborers, people coming up, but really it was people who were also investors, many people who were businessmen who had gone bankrupt during the financial crisis or lost everything, lost all of their savings or wound up in trouble there. I mean, you had people who were running from the law, people who were con artists, predators. There was a lot of, people who really wanted a new start, wanted to hide out, just wanted to recreate themselves. In some ways, I thought a lot about the California gold rush. I thought about the Klondike and the Alaskan pipeline boom in the 70s. It had some similar dynamics there.
in North Dakota, there hadn't been as much pipeline, so it required the need for an awful lot of truckloads of all kinds of things, the oil itself, but also water, dirt, and gravel, and chemicals, and things like that.
A lot has been written on fracking and oil fields, but I haven't really seen anybody pick up on, this element of truck driving that just jumped out at me right away when I was in North Dakota. Trucking was the most common job. There's a lower barrier to entry, as long as you can pass a CDL test. North Dakota just did not have the infrastructure that places like Texas had, or maybe even Pennsylvania. I mean, you need several thousand loads of fresh water to be delivered from a water depot to a frack site, or from, an oil tank to a railroad station to transport it to refineries. So, I mean, that led not just to inconvenience because locals couldn't really go anywhere. It would take 45 minutes to go what had been maybe 20 minutes before. But it also led to a lot of deaths on the road. So I learned that a lot of people there, a lot of the locals had lost at least somebody they knew on these roads. Trucks were tipping over every day. And, these people who were driving were often quite exhausted. They were really inexperienced. Some were on drugs or drinking. So, and the roads were really not made for this heavy industrial traffic to come through. I mean, these were really just narrow farm roads that shouldn't have been used for that purpose. So that's why I decided in the book to profile a truck driver named Danny from North Carolina who came up there on a whim. Didn't really know what he was doing. He had been a surfer and sort of a beach bum for a while and was fumbling his way along, as he steers 100,000 pounds down the road. Kind of a harebrained scheme with a couple of other friends to make his way up there and figure out how to drive a truck.
But a lot of people were doing things like this. A lot of you referenced that, so many of the people were coming from areas maybe in West Virginia or other parts of the South where there wasn't as much opportunity, and looking at North Dakota, and they certainly found work and some high wages. They also found other issues, high rents, a lot of overcrowding.
For most people, if they set their mind to it and worked hard, they would probably be able to come out all right. Some people would get sort of distracted up there. I mean, I actually knew one roughneck who was telling me that people who are starting to make, the most money they had ever made in their lives. So once you're at that point, he was saying you don't just save all of that right away. You want to at least enjoy yourself a little bit first for a couple years, and then you'll save. So a lot of people, I heard one guy was joking about how his friends would fly out to Las Vegas after making $17,000 just a couple months, and they'd come home and eat ramen noodles till their next paycheck. So there was a lot of just flowing cash. And I want to be clear, it's not just there's a stereotype that it's blue-collar workers who were doing that, but I found that's not always true. I mean, one of the biggest, most prominent examples in my book was a British developer who came in, was in the man camp business, and he was known for spending $400 per shot on luxury cognac and,
Yes.
spending money at strip clubs, buying everyone around. The authorities claimed that he ran a worldwide Ponzi scheme, setting up these man camps, getting people from all over the world to invest in them and promising these really huge rates of returns. And so that industry could also draw people who were looking for a really get-rich-quick type scheme.
Yeah, talk a bit about the man camps. It seemed to be the symbol of the new North Dakota. There were just there were so many people coming. They really didn't have places for them to live, did they?
Basically, a lot of people could come in and see that they could make money setting up man camps, these groupings of trailers, temporary trailers for men to stay in, as there was not enough permanent housing yet. But that caused a lot of controversy, with city leaders who at some point, they really wanted to kick man camps out. They wanted to be a permanent town. And people who support man camps say that they are actually performing an important purpose because, the cycle of oil can go up and down, and you don't want to be stuck with all this brick and mortar infrastructure when oil moves around, even from different towns. There's different towns where sometimes there's more oil activity, sometimes there's less, even within the same Bakken region. So I really reported a lot on the battle. It was really heating up in 2015 as oil prices crashed and a lot of people left. A lot of apartment developers who had built all this new infrastructure were begging for tenants, and they were angry that man camps could sort of undercut them. These facilities that were cheaper to run and maintain. And so they began pressuring City Hall to kick them out. And that led to a court battle, but it was really just a symbol of this broader debate about temporary versus permanent interests. Do you want to be a boom town and a temporary town, or do you want to be a really civilized industry town that's sort of a normal level of activity?
Yeah, it seems to get into so many issues, that local versus newly arrived. There's a lot of talk in American politics. Oh, what's great about America, you can go from state to state, and you can move with your feet if you don't like politics. This is kind of the libertarian the strength of their argument, and I can see that point to a certain extent. I also think that there are issues with, okay, yes, you can move wherever you want, but the locals can create some obstacles, and the locals aren't always your friend, and you may not have the numbers in local politics to create the things you need. Sometimes these man camps were just like shipping containers that were put into an empty field.
Yeah, there were shipping container parks, but I think most man camps were higher quality than that. And actually, there's a major man camp company, Target Logistics. They're really praised for their professionalism. That you go in there and they've got food available all the time, strict regulations on alcohol and drugs and weapons, and but you've also got other companies that may not be doing it right. Then when you're in McKenzie County, it's more rural. I mean, there's really no building regulation until the boom was a couple years in, and they really didn't have the manpower to know everything that was in their jurisdiction. So people could just build things and just stick things wherever. And there was just not a lot of oversight into who is sticking a trailer park or RV park or shipping container park, anywhere they want.
One of the downsides, I think, in the North Dakota example, is just the amount of employee accidents and the amount of worker deaths that occurred.
Yeah, people. Yeah, there were two different types of danger. I mean, one was from working too fast, people being sleepy, people. Often people would really get into accidents. They were more likely to get into an accident when they were on the road driving to or from a shift rather than being on a rig. And then, people would work a long shift and try to drive home to another state right after. They'd fall asleep on the road. Trucking accidents. There was, in one of the earliest examples of a major worker death, it was back in about 2010, there was a worker who was very inexperienced, and they didn't teach him enough protocol about safety and putting on flame-resistant clothing. And so there was some sort of blow-up on the rig, and his body was really badly burned. So you see things like that earlier in the boom where people are rushing and make mistakes. But there's also a certain level of danger that happens regardless of oil prices or regardless of the pace that something's going at. So in the book, I write about how Danny, the truck driver, was, hauling oil and had to get on top of these oil tanks and gauge the oil and measure it and load it into the truck. So there had been, at that time I had met him, some controversy about workers dying from these really toxic fumes. And there was controversy about why they were made to go all the way up there and have to stand directly over the tanks. And when you open them, it releases this big toxic plume. And why they couldn't do it remotely, as it's often done in Canada. So that's something that's still sort of, one of those ongoing types of dangers.
You worked as a cashier for a while. right in the middle of all of this. And what was that like?
Yeah, so I was a cashier at the Wild Bison truck stop, and I did that because I wanted to kind of understand what it was like from a worker's perspective. And at that point, retailers were really notorious for having big problems in getting any employees to work there. The wages were often $14 an hour, $17 an hour just to cashier or do a retail job because everyone wanted to get a higher paying oil job. And so there was just really crazy turnover. And I really enjoyed my job because at the cash register, you can meet so many different workers coming in. So if there was someone I had a good conversation with, I would write their number down and call them later. But you get a sense of all the rhythms of oil field life. I mean, you see all the junk food people eat. They were telling me that they don't have any woman to cook for them here. So they're just, eating beef jerky. And, I sold so many cans of chewing tobacco. I had to learn all these different brands that I had never heard of before. And that's also because people cannot smoke cigarettes on oil sites. So that's something that people can do instead. And you learn, I couldn't believe how much people spend on diesel fuel. Truck drivers giving me a corporate credit card and charging $900 just to fill up the gas. So it's really, truck stops are just a really important part of oil field life. They're just these mini economic hubs, and they're just places where everyone comes together in the middle of their shift. And sometimes, all this has changed a little bit in the last couple of years, but at one time that truck stop was really the only place on a major stretch of highway between two of the major oil towns. It's the only place to really stop and get any food. So people don't always eat food at all the restaurants. It was really common to just eat a meal at a truck stop.
Long lines in that, crowded.
But yeah, the lines could add up very quickly.
My job in high school or going into college back when was worked at a deli, and I always felt like there's no better way to meet a ton of people and also to see exactly what products are hot and not, and what people are buying, and then I learned about all kinds of cigarette brands it seemed like 2,700 different types of flavors that I wouldn't have known before that. But yeah, no, it's certainly an interesting way to do kind of anthropology. I think a person told you in terms of North Dakota that her feeling was you just have to kind of put up with the opposite of the American dream a little, and then when you go home, that's when you can have it.
Yeah, it depends, but I would say a lot of people shared that view. I also know people, and it's probably a minority of the overall group that was there. A lot of there was still a sizable number that also really loved it there, or came to love it, or they decided to settle there. I would say, especially immigrants. There were a lot of African immigrants. I read about an Iraqi immigrant in the book. They especially really loved that area. And so I've heard a much different viewpoint from them. But the woman you're mentioning, she made a comment that was really interesting because I met her when I was reporting on this really odd encampment by a landfill. There were a lot of people living in trailers and in this sort of industrial park by this landfill, which sounds really bad, and it looks bad at first when you go there. And I was asking around why people were living there, and they were explaining that it's, kind of a nice secluded area. You can live there much more cheaply than in town. And they had built this sort of, strong community back there. One guy was living in, like, his company put their employers in what looked like these sort of small tool sheds. So they've got a bed and a TV and everything like that. One guy was saying, some people make fun of his shed, but he's living there for free. And back home, his mortgage is almost being paid off. He can send all his salary back home and, to his wife and kids and get that paid off. So there were definitely, people that were just putting up with conditions that they don't seem, were trying to take a long-term view about what they were really there for, which is just saving as much money as possible.
looking out my window. It's like a play. Something strange happens every day.
Down the way was the Little Missouri Grill, a comfort inn, an old grain elevator, a bank, and the future home of a Mexican restaurant where customers would also be able to cash checks, get cell phones repaired, and send MoneyGrams.
Even when the storm's washing it all away, just grabbing leaves to float.
A 30-foot white bust of Theodore Roosevelt, dressed in a suit and tie, stared onto the highway, looking out from the parking lot of a hotel named in his honor.
Just two doors down, Mark and Jane.
His mustache drooped. His hair was cropped closely. The narrow eyes, rimmed by spectacles, seemed almost jaded, as though he had seen too much and was looking past it all. Trucks rumbled back and forth to deliver construction materials for the massive new developments that conjured some distant idol. Bison Run, Pheasant Ridge, trailers loomed on the hillside like gargantuan tombstones. They hadn't built the highway to accommodate the 12,000 vehicles that passed each day between Williston and Watford City, a 6-fold increase from before the oil boom. Farmers who lived a half-mile back from the road stopped hanging their clothes out to dry because the fabric would become soiled by flying dust from the traffic that snarled and spat like the New Jersey Turnpike during rush hour. I was late to several appointments on account of delays. The highway was only 2 lanes, and laborers were widening it to 4 as part of the largest road construction project in state history.
Cargo pants, used bits in the street. Barber shops now, they sit near me. And coffee and ice cream, bread fun, you're alright. Only crime is to gentrify. I'm getting used to this town around me, and the girl who dragged me to Sydney.
And the wages were high. I mean, the people were making, you had people in their 20s, easily making over 100,000, and I guess depending on what you did.
Yeah. So usually, though, to get those high wages, it was pretty common for people to work 80 hours a week or more. So probably when you work it out hourly, it probably wasn't as high as it looked. But yeah, people were making really good money for a while. And then when oil prices fell, wages are still higher, but they've had to come down a lot. And like a lot of the perks that people used to get, they don't have as much of that anymore. And I remember people would complain, that they could only get 40 hours a week now. That was considered not real work. I mean, people wanted a lot of hours, a lot of overtime. And that's a large part of that is because you're in North Dakota, so it's cold, it's isolated, it's far from your family. So that's only going to be worth it if you get a bigger paycheck.
And at least initially, rents were, first of all, hard to find housing, and then pretty high. I mean, you had some, what I would consider to be New York, New Jersey rates.
When I was out there, I knew a lot of other people had covered that angle. So I was actually, one thing that I found fascinating that I wrote about in the book that I don't think gets talked about enough is that after oil prices fell, developers didn't really lower the rents as much as they should have, given that a lot of people were taking pay cuts and leaving and losing their jobs. But these developers, to build there, it was really expensive, the land and the subcontractors and the materials. And so there was this feeling of desperation they had. And yet it took them so long to lower their rents to meet the need. And that just furthered the exodus, where people were like, I have no job and there's not enough work here during the oil price crash. And so they leave. And so that whole thing was really fascinating to watch as developers were really desperate when it flipped so quickly. In less than a year's time, developers who had once been accused of being greedy and overcharging everybody were now really desperate for tenants and desperate to not lose their investment.
Yeah, no, I had done a little look. Williston was the town. Some of them were down to, you saw some, where it used to be 2,000. Now some of them are 1,000 a month. It sounds kind of high for North Dakota, but certainly, not as high as it was. So it went down. Yeah, I mean, we had done an episode a while back called "The Dark Side of Booms," and it focused on the 1920s. Before I issue this episode, I will have replayed that episode. We talked about a lot of good things about the 1920s. One of the things is many of the suburbs that people now, are highly developed in Burbank, California, various towns outside Chicago, Paramus, New Jersey. These were relatively small, not very well developed places that just boomed in the 1920s, kind of in a similar way. And the 1920s brought a high level of employment, good wages for some, new benefits like stock purchasing, but it also had some downsides. During the same period in the later part of the 1920s, there was definitely a price inflation, rents and going up, less space. People that thought that they had a lot of space or their house was not adjoining anything, now we're seeing new subdivisions. A lot more availability of credit and using of credit for purchases. More working on speculation. People, in other words, doing a lot of work hoping for payment in stocks, or having put a lot of money into stocks, and then some made out, some didn't. And just a general anxiety and a lot of hours and a pace to keep up with, because in a boom period like the 20s, while people felt better, they also felt like others were getting ahead or doing more. Any of that sound familiar when we look at the North Dakota example?
Yeah, there were definitely some similarities. One thing that was interesting about the oil field was that people in the oil business, of course, know that there's booms and busts, and they had just come up the financial crisis too. So you could see people had seen that housing had crashed, but they just kept telling themselves, like, this one is different. This is the big one. This boom's going to last 20 years. It's never going to end. Throughout history, you'll see people think, oh, this one is going to be different. This is really the big one. And
right.
People seem to forget historical examples or minimize them because they get really caught up emotionally.
Yeah, I think that, and you could see where it would happen. In the 1920s, it was about, this is different because we have the automobile, because we have the radio. We have new methods of consumer financing. Consumers are more powerful now and able to buy more things. These are all new technologies that we didn't have before. So this boom's going to last forever. In North Dakota, I mean, if I was to speculate, I could see that the idea of fracking and how much extra oil and that can produce, and that technique versus your standard drilling, and the amount of oil located there, it probably seemed like things will last forever. But I mean, in some ways, the very nature of the Bakken oil find had an impact on global oil prices. There was more supply. So it's right. It was almost self-fulfilling thing, it was certainly not going to last forever.
This one oil worker, and I met him for an interview at this truck stop during 2015 in the real height of the oil crash. He just said they just drilled themselves out of existence. And I stole that line in the book because I really liked it. It's so funny how, people that get caught up in this, they want to just do it as fast as possible. That was a big criticism of the North Dakota oil boom that I'm sure you'll find in any other historical example. But there were questions about why state regulators kept giving out drilling permits pretty much as fast as they were requested, instead of taking a more moderate, measured approach so that there would be time to build infrastructure, time to build roads and pipelines. But oil moves quickly, and, rigs and frac sites, everyone was working 24 hours a day. Oil was at 100 a barrel, and they wanted to maximize that.
Yeah, it's certainly hard to regulate, hard to get people to slow down, and the state didn't have, I suppose, the infrastructure to manage it all.
One of the things I thought was interesting was just how, aside from approving drilling permits, just their whole regulatory framework was often really lagging behind the height of a certain problem, whether it was flaring or illegal waste dumping or pipeline spills. Regulators would often wait till there was some big catastrophe or a lot of media scrutiny, and then they'd finally try to come up with something. But by then, the problem would have been ebbing a little bit. There was just always seemed to be this total mismatch of timing, which I think is just the nature of a boom. By the time the government can act and do anything, it's often too late.
A reminder that I'm speaking with Maya Rao. She's the author of Great American Outpost, Dreamers, Mavericks, and the Making of an Oil Frontier. I know one of the things that you talk about is how you were living in an area of housing for women across from a Walmart, and you talk a bit about this. Really seems like a male-driven world that North Dakota became in the last decade.
A lot of times I really just forgot I was a woman. I wasn't really thinking about it, and nobody was really making an issue of it, and I was able to get on rigs, and nobody was bothering me. And so then sometimes when it became an issue, I would really be caught off guard or really shocked. And the biggest example of that is when I'd been, during the boom, I'd been crashing on couches and spare mattresses and all those sort of things. But at some point I wanted to, once I got this book deal, just sign an apartment lease and really get a place. And I knew I'd have to share it with other people because housing was still expensive. Mm-hmm. I assumed I might have some men who were housemates, and that didn't really bother me because I wasn't planning on being home that much. But I would respond to some ads on Craigslist, and when they learned I was a woman, there was really this resistance. And one landlord told me, we don't want to discriminate, but we can't put anyone in a compromising situation. And there is this fear, not that the woman or that I would do anything wrong, but that if you have male roommates, then some guy could bother you, and then the landlord is liable. And there was this general feeling that the genders should be segregated, especially in housing. And that's why, it was common for, even at man camps, they're really not allowed to have guests. A lot of that, that keeps out prostitutes, that keeps out, it's just a barrier there. And for women, I finally found this ad on Craigslist that was a house for all women. And I got a basement room in there. And we also were not allowed to have guests. And part of that was, a fear that somebody's oil worker boyfriend might trash the place. Mm-hmm. So everybody just generally thought that we should be all kept separate. And I think it was great to live in a house of all women, and that would have always been my preference. But, I knew that I wasn't going to be at home that much, and I wanted to pick housing based on where I wanted to live and not have any other restriction. And so I had never really wanted to live in the oil town of Williston. I had hoped to live, there were some other oil towns I was more interested in living in, but I had to go with this place that was, I felt like it would be safe. It would be, it was also safe because it was on the major road. So if there's any blizzard or any issue, we were right there in the middle of everything. But it was really fascinating to meet these other women. There were several women who were house cleaners there. And so, house cleaning was a very common job in the Bakken. And it did not have this lower class stigma that it has in many other parts of the country. In the Bakken, this is a very high paid, very lucrative job. And so people can make really good money cleaning because all these men don't have the time to clean up after themselves, and they can pay somebody to do it. So it was interesting to learn about that business a little bit more when I lived there.
I'm sure I missed one of the many stories or anything else that you think is really important for people to know.
Yeah, I was very fascinated when I was there, and I tried to write a lot about this, but this culture of con artists that come up there, people who, are on the run from the law, people who would come up with these really interesting schemes. I met a drug trafficker. I met some guys who had been under investigation by the SEC. I reported on that Ponzi schemer from England. I thought it was very fascinating that all these people that, sort of make headlines for their scandals just converge in the middle of nowhere in North Dakota from all these different states. And when you're there was really a feeling that you could be talking to anybody. They could be wanted in another state. They could be running $1 million drug trafficking ring. You really have no idea. You can't tell. You would think that you could tell. You really can't. So that to me was one of the most fascinating parts of the experience of being there.
Great. Well, Maya, thanks for coming on My History Can Beat Up Your Politics.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me.
We want to thank Maya Rao for coming on the program. Again, the book is great. American Outpost, Dreamers, Mavericks, and the Making of an Oil Frontier. That is from Public Affairs Press, and Public Affairs has been pretty good to My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. Don't forget, our website is www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. There you can sign up for the premium podcast, help the program, and get extra episodes. Real quick, I want to thank, we have two musical artists that music was featured. Lee Rosevear is someone who I've played a lot on this program. His music is available at the Free Music Archive website. And we also have Josh Armistead, and that song that you heard in the middle of it is Red Fern. So seemed like a good North Dakota highway song. Again, go to that website, www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. Thanks for listening.